Welcome to Byju's IAS. We are very happy to be back again and to take you along on a journey of exploring the events in international relations around the world. The developments in recent past have been very exciting. The immediate environment, the strategic environment of India has changed, and not necessarily to the advantage of Indian national interest. There have been other flashpoints developing on other continents. We must take a look on them. And there is a very fluid situation almost everywhere. There is need to have a quick retrospective historical review to get the feel, get the context, but at the same time the day-to-day developments are changing so fast that we probably will be following some of these stories in coming weeks also with you. We would be very happy to begin with the immediate neighborhood, which is where Afghanistan. And the problem with Afghanistan is that some people think is after the withdrawal of the American troops from Afghanistan, the end game has begun. Others are not so optimistic. They think that this is not the end game. This is the beginning of another long drawn, protracted civil war in Afghanistan. Then there are developments on the African continent. South Africa has been ablaze, looting and rioting after the arrest of ex-president Jacob Zuma. There has been renewed activity of Boko Haram in Nigeria. All these are causing concern because both with South Africa and Nigeria, India has had close relationships, economic, cultural, political, diplomatic, and all this seems to be at the moment in some kind of a jeopardy. We will have to discuss this carefully. This is what we intend to do this week. As soon as President Biden of the United States made a statement that he would bring back the American troops from Afghanistan latest by 11th September of this year, which was an anniversary of 9/11, it was clear to the rest of the world that America was accepting that it had ended up its mission without accomplishing anything in Afghanistan. It was a face-saving kind of a thing. It gives something celebratory to the domestic population at home that all the boys were coming home. But this longest war in American history had ended without a victory for the United States of America. And it was almost like a replay, deja vu, of the retreat from Vietnam, which was a slightly shorter war, where the American casualties had been larger in terms of soldiers dying. But even in Afghanistan, at the peak of deployment, more than 100,000 American soldiers were there, and it has been estimated that close to $2.25 trillion had been invested, spent on the deployment of these troops and trying to protect Afghanistan from the menace of Taliban running it over. But this, whether America accepts its if not defeat, its incapacity, like before the Soviets had to do it, much before that the British had to do it, and reinforcing the reputation of Afghanistan as a graveyard of imperial powers is another issue. What our primary concern is, where do we go from here? When we say, where do we go from here, we mean what are the Indian interests and what can India do to protect it in Afghanistan. So far, Indians had been made to understand by the American friends, strategic partners, that India as an emerging power had a role commensurate with its ambitions to invest in Afghanistan and maybe, if not take over for Americans, replace them and establish its major presence there. Now, Indians could do that as long as the Americans were providing the security cover for the Indian development workers there, as long as the government in Kabul had the protection and the armed forces of the government of Afghanistan, de jure, were being trained by the Americans. Now, what has become clear by now is that although the Taliban may be smaller in number than the total number of the Afghan armed forces, their morale is higher, their fighting capabilities are much better, and the way the Afghan armed forces are crumbling and the Taliban are extending their control over the territory, it is quite clear that in a very short span of time, the Taliban might be celebrating their victory and recapturing Kabul. At the moment is a last-ditch battle being fought. The Taliban's claim that they have control of more than 85% of the territory. They have encircled almost all the major cities, Kabul, Kandahar, Zafrabad, Herat, Bamiyan, everything, Badakhshan. And the trouble is that once they enforce this siege around the cities, there might be a situation of food shortages, fuel shortages, and they are destroying roads and other infrastructure. Now, there are two arguments. Some people, some strategic experts who want to retain an optimistic outlook and justify commitment and presence in Afghanistan say we cannot retreat from Afghanistan, even if the Americans have done that. We can't leave a power vacuum there. But do we have the capacity to maintain our presence there when the American support is not there? We have put, so far, unfortunately, all our eggs in the Kabul basket. We have very friendly relationship with the Kabul government. But so far we have tried not to establish any contact with the Taliban. Now the Taliban, as the whole world knows, are creatures of Pakistan and American CIA, the deep state, and Pakistan has a relationship with Taliban which we never can establish to match, expect to match. And the problem is, Taliban are not a black box or a billiard ball. They are different factions in Taliban. The American president, ex-President Obama used to say good Taliban and bad Taliban. And you see, the trouble is that this definition of Taliban as good and bad suited then the American national interest, American strategic interest, who wanted to start negotiations and have a negotiated withdrawal of the American troops. Now, that strategy has failed miserably. For the past some time, there have been talks going on in Doha. Much hopes were aroused about that a new generation of Taliban had come, their outlook had changed, their families were settled meaning staying at the moment as esteemed guests in UAE and in Saudi Arab, and they would say that these people probably would be in a position to be more reasonable than the earlier generation of Taliban, and they probably had learnt, wiser by experience, that they could not win without winning the support of the Afghan population, could not rule the country. This, I think, is an analysis which is a bit naive, because the Taliban do not have an identification with the Afghan nation. They are tribal people, primordial loyalties, warlords in different territories, different geographies of landlocked Afghanistan, who have fattened themselves with the opium trade. So they are not really interested about inheriting an infrastructure intact. They are not really interested in development of a democratic polity in Afghanistan. Most of the Taliban leaders believe that the form of non-modern, non-Western democracy, primitive democracy which they practice as tribal leaders, Majlis-e-Shura, that probably suits Afghanistan the best. Even a greater problem is the temper of the Taliban as Islamic militants. Now the point is that one can hair split and say the Taliban are better than the Mujahideen whom they had replaced before they were ousted from Kabul 20 years ago. But the problem is that all Talibans agree on one fundamental thing, that they are going to establish an Islamic republic in Afghanistan, and they would enforce the law of Sharia. They are in the territories under their control, they are dispensing swift justice with the law of Sharia, and this is what is making the Afghans who have lived without the Taliban for the past 2 decades very, very worried. They think that the women's rights will be trampled upon. They think that the courts would become not responsible to anybody else but Qazis and Maulvis. And Taliban would sooner or later have a closer relationship with the more fundamentalist, more militant caliphate elements or others. So that's one. But that is all a matter of speculation. What is a matter of concern to India is when the Doha round of negotiations started, nobody thought that India deserved a place on the high table. They tried, by courtesy, they would, on the sidelines of Doha, meet certain people, try to make amends for past neglect of Taliban, but that's it. But what is even more worrisome is that the Doha round of talks with Taliban has stalled. More than 6 months have passed, there have been stalemates, and now, interestingly, another round of high-power talks have started in Tehran. Iran has taken the lead to bring together the major powers, the Chinese, the Russians, of course the Taliban, the Pakistan, and on the sidelines, Turkey. Now all these countries have a very, very intrinsic relationship of ethnicity, of religion, and also of past shared geographies. Take for instance Tajikistan, Iran and Afghans. were parts of the great Persian Empire long years ago. They have linguistic affinities, they have ethnic affinities, and the border is very, very porous. Now what happens if you talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan? They have the Pakhtunistan area, they have the northwest frontier provinces, they have the tribal agencies, and here again, Afghanistan and Pakistan have a shared geography. Now, the same applies to Uzbekistan, the same applies to Kazakhstan, the same applies to Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan. Now, what happens is this peculiar geopolitical situation leaves little scope for India. India theoretically has a very small strip of land sharing the border with Afghanistan in what is the Pak-occupied Kashmir at the moment, and this is far too away. For past 70 years, we have had no direct contacts with Afghanistan. So there is a problem with India claiming that it has absolutely vital interest in Afghanistan if you analyze it dispassionately. Now, some people also argue that India has made a massive investment thanks to American persuasion, invested $3 billion there in the construction of a new Afghan parliamentary building, in a huge dam, Salma Dam, which is called Afghan-India Friendship Dam, which is supposed to, at the peak of its capacity, look after the irrigation of 35,000 hectares of land in the western Afghanistan. And the road which leads up to the dam. But what is distressing is that the Taliban, it has been reported, have sent people to attack these symbols of Indo-Afghan friendship, which is not so much Indo-Afghan friendship. In their view, it is Indo-Kabul government friendship which the Talibans are fighting against. Now, nobody can say that logically Taliban should destroy these assets. But as I said before, Talibans are not interested in leading a life of peace, hard work, irrigation, farming, although there have been fertile valleys in Afghanistan which have grown very nice crops. But once there is a long-drawn civil war, once the people get used to wielding power through the barrel of a gun, once they get used to illicit contraband trade like opium, which is the largest producer of opium in the world, and it is smuggled to Western countries, will they give all that up and subordinate their vested interests to the government in Kabul, or agree very easily on power sharing? This is something which we have to very much worry about. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs has been working overtime. Our External Affairs Minister has been very active. He has been to Dushanbe, he has been to Moscow, he has been to Georgia, he has been trying to cultivate these relationships so that India can again have some kind of a voice in the other negotiations which are taking place. Now, unfortunately, it has also been suggested by people that while the Americans engaged India, involved India in the Quad in the South Pacific or the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific region, they have themselves sponsored another Quad in this Central Asian region where India is out. So India can probably delude itself that it has a massive investment there, but we go back to the same figures. If the Americans could not get any returns on their $2.25 trillion investment in Afghanistan and their massive military deployment and high-tech war which they fought with the Taliban, there is little scope which India can do to replace them. And probably it would be a bad idea to throw good money after bad money to retain a presence. The reports are that the Afghan general, military commander, is going to visit India and also interact with the Indian chief of the army staff. But these would be probably efforts to build up its morale. There have been news photographs, there have been news items from the government sources that the Taliban have been annihilated, air power has been used against them. But it is difficult to imagine. It all appears to be activity undertaken not so much to annihilate and defeat the Taliban as to keep up the morale of the armed forces which are surrendering in areas under Taliban control. The Taliban are ruthless, they are killing and terrorizing people. So people are leaving villages and concentrating in the cities, little realizing that cities are going to be encircled by Taliban, and it is only a matter of time before the strangulation starts. Now, it's also difficult to imagine how long can the Air Force fly as long the fuel is being destroyed by the Taliban, and this is logistical support is going to be more and more difficult. So India is going to be faced with this problem of trying to restrain the flow of violence and terrorism from Afghanistan to India, to the territories of Jammu and Kashmir, and probably convey to Pakistan that we don't intend to have a pincer to pitchfork them on two fronts. But will Pakistan be persuaded to believe this? Because right now it seems that China, Pakistan, Iran have a common interest in not necessarily stabilizing Afghanistan, but manipulating Afghanistan to their own respective interests. And the coincidence of interest between Pakistan, Iran and China, and to a certain extent even Turkey, seems to be a much more powerful influence on events that are unfolding and limited Indian capabilities. The news that we have received from South Africa has been most depressing and distressing. There was widespread looting and rioting which broke out after the arrest of ex-President Jacob Zuma in cities like Johannesburg and spread very soon to other cities, other provinces. The President Ramaphosa was forced to deploy 20,000 soldiers, armed forces to control it, but it was, some people say, too little too late. 200 people had died by then, more than 1,200 people had been arrested, and they are still taking account of the loss of property which has taken place. All this is happening when the country is reeling under the threat of a third wave of COVID. It had earlier had to suffer a similar kind of a plight when the AIDS pandemic was there. It is not only ironical, but very seriously, sadly tragic that a country so full of promise, so richly endowed by nature with resources, has been suffering for decades. When apartheid ended, the racism, people thought that now there would be some peace, some hope of prosperity equitably shared in South Africa, but this was not to be. For the past 3 decades, the African National Congress has ruled South Africa. This was a party which was headed once by Nelson Mandela, with which Bishop Tutu was involved. But unfortunately, for the past 9 years, 10 years, the reign of President Jacob Zuma has been by most scholars described as wasted years. Now what's wrong? Now even today, when the President Ramaphosa was asked what was the cause of this rioting, this kind of a rebellion of the people against the government, he said that maybe the immediate provocation was Jacob Zuma's arrest, but this was not a protest confined to this one incident. There have been glaring disparities between the rich and the poor in South Africa. He said earlier the apartheid was between whites and blacks. But what we are witnessing, even after the transfer of power to the blacks, is that the effective control of multinational corporations over diamond mines, gold mines, other consumer durables and products remains in hands of people who are not blacks there. They may claim to be South African citizens, but residual impact of apartheid continues. But what is more honest is when somebody puts the question straight away, how 3 decades after the end of apartheid you can still blame the legacy of apartheid. The interesting part is that now there is a new form of apartheid in South Africa between the extremely vulgarly rich exploitive community and the downtrodden and the wretched of the earth, to borrow an old phrase from the colonial times, who have nothing. So they have no stakes in stability, they have no stakes in peace, and they are what the president called opportunistic criminals, opportunistic looters. Now, you can call them bandits, but whatever you call them, you cannot gloss over the fact that 20% of the population of South Africa controls more than 70% of its resources, leads a lifestyle which is offensive, which is vulgar, which is provocative, and the majority of population of South Africa lives in abject poverty, in slums, denied running water, denied electricity, denied any facilities for their children, for education. Employment is at all-time high of 32%, and no government has tried to rectify this situation. Why? The corruption is rampant, and President Jacob Zuma's presidency was perhaps the glaring example of this. Now, the cases are on. Ex-President Zuma keeps saying that he is a victim of a political vendetta, but the fact remains that he was presiding over crony capitalism in a manner which was now intolerable for the population at large. So when this time the looting started, people were looting food grains, people were looting clothes, people were looting soft drink bottles, and they were shot down. And there is great resentment against the government, especially Ramaphosa's government, who rather than addressing mismanagement of economy, rooting out corruption, is trying to use law and order and turning a military against its own people. Now, whatever might be the compulsions of President Ramaphosa, he again has to balance various factions in his party. Unfortunately, nobody has a charisma like Nelson Mandela or Bishop Tutu, and this problem is not going to be solved in a hurry. Something even more worrisome for India is that the properties of Indians has been targeted, their shops and malls have been looted, and one cannot forget that the charges of corruption which are alleged against President Jacob Zuma relate to his crony capitalistic patronage of a Indian entrepreneur of Indian origin, the Gupta family, who made one of his sons the company director in their conglomerate. They decided who would join the cabinet, they decided who would get what portfolios, and they flaunted their wealth. They had shares in wildlife sanctuaries, they had a finger in every pie, and when their chartered aircraft landed in an Air Force airbase, that was the beginning of the end. Their hubris knew no limit, and they have to move out of South Africa. But Indians have been targeted because of the Gupta family also. This time the Indians have been targeted, and when the Indian property was being attacked, the Indians came out with guns and fired at the looters. Now the looters were invariably black, and the people protecting their property were non-blacks, whites, or not even whites, Indians, browns in this case. Now, the president was forced to make an appeal to people of Indian diaspora, people of Indian origin in South Africa, that look, we are all South Africans, whether we are Indians, whether we are blacks, we should treat this country as our country, and there should not be an ethnic dimension added to this lawlessness, anarchy. It is easier said than done. Indians have not endeared themselves ever since the days of Mahatma Gandhi. So although we nourish the feeling that Mahatma Gandhi's presence in South Africa led to a strong foundations of our relationship with this country, but the fact remains that Mahatma Gandhi's statues have been vandalized, not only in South Africa, but in some other African countries also, because the feeling is that not Mahatma, but some of the Indians, most of the Indians, sided or positioned themselves between the whites and the blacks. They considered themselves superior to blacks. They had a very strong ethnic bond. People coming from India, Pakistan, Israel, which is now Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, stuck together, and they did not fight for the... Mahatma Gandhi was an exception who took part in the Zulu war, but these prejudices continue. And in this case, there have been very unpleasant instances of one of Mahatma Gandhi's great-granddaughters being alleged in a fraud charge. There have been attacks in the Phoenix Ashram, which Mahatma Gandhi had established. So it is difficult for India to maintain this myth that we have a special relationship with South Africa because we are members of the BRICS, because we were members before the BRICS came to IBSA. The distance is great. Sentimental nostalgia will not take us too far. The interest of Western countries, Americans, French, Dutch, Germans and others, and the multinational corporations, the British, continue to be strong vested interest in South Africa, and Indians don't match that. And when the Indians tried to grow too large for their boots, it is like the misdemeanors of the Gupta family. And so we have to worry about the ethnic racial sensitivities of the African people in their own country. We can't look down on them, we can't look down on their poverty, we can't look down on their superstitions, we can't look down on their tribal reflexes when a pandemic breaks out, because we ourselves have shown some of these elements in our fight against COVID. It is important for India to realize today in 2021 that memories of the nostalgia of Mahatma Gandhi's stay in South Africa cannot take us very far. It is equally important for us to realize that our playing cricket has limitations of solidarity with South Africa. We also must realize that there might be tricontinental multinational cooperation forums like BRICS and IBSA, but there again, over a period of time, the realistic utility of these organizations has been exposed. There is a very limited use. So the distance is there, and once we thought that, and for this only Indians are not to blame. South Africans were reckoned to be an industrialized nation. They were supposed to be the gateway and door which would open the path of prosperity for the rest of Africa. But there has been a rise in what we shall say a reverse racism, where people are becoming more and more conscious of the colonial exploitation of the colored people, in which part of the exploitation was made easier by indentured labor brought from South Asia. The Indians played the roles of intermediaries, and these memories are hurtful for the Africans. Now, it will be a long time before the history can be written satisfactorily for all parties concerned, but till that time it happens, the misunderstandings will grow, explode, and we have to worry about this. So what do we do? Has there been a stock taking that what is the real Indian economic interest investment in South Africa? What are the possibilities of technological cooperation between India and South Africa? You might announce various things, but what has been the implementation part of that? Now, Indian diplomats would prefer to stay in a Western capital style of South Africa, but would they like to take a serious assessment that aren't our interests more entrenched in countries like Nigeria, in countries like oil exporting countries besides Nigeria like Algeria, in the Maghreb area? So we move from South Africa and we perhaps take a quick look at Nigeria. Now, Nigeria is an oil exporting country. India has had a very good relationship with it, but we don't seem to remember that Nigeria is a country which is again divided ethnically along religious sectarian grounds, and there has been a civil war ever since Biafra, which has the hurt feelings run deep in that country. In recent past, Boko Haram, an Islamic fundamentalist group, has been expanding its footprint from eastern Nigeria to northwestern Nigeria, and very recently, what they call bandits shot down a Nigerian Air Force plane, and the Nigerian government tried to reassure its armed forces that the pilot escaped successfully, bailed out, but the fact remains it was a gunfire which shot down an Air Force plane. So the power of the so-called bandits, opportunistic criminals, is as dangerous in Nigeria as anywhere else. These Boko Haram people are fundamentalists. They have been kidnapping. This year alone, more than 700 school children, boys and girls, have been kidnapped. They have been mistreated. They have been mutilated and maimed. And at times they have been released after the bandits, the kidnappers, have received large ransoms paid by state governments, contributed to by the children's parents, who can ill afford to do that. These bandits are better armed than the armed forces, who are not regularly paid their salaries. Nigeria is again on the verge of a failed state. It is an oil producing state, but it is a country polluted by exploitation of oil. It is a country which is divided by ethnicity and sectarian interest. Unfortunately, there is large-scale corruption, and the government seems to have lost its will to control and exercise its sovereignty over its territory. On the contrary, the Boko Haram people have close tied with the Islamic State of the West African Caliphate, and the names may change, but the ISIL in one form or the other seems to be active in this area. So from Nigeria to Mali to Chad to Malawi, all the way down to Uganda, you have this problem, and Indians have a stake because we import a reasonable amount of oil from Nigeria. We have financial investments there, including bank, but the law and order situation there is quite disturbing, not only for Indians, but other countries which have stakes in Nigeria. So this whole continent is today confronting us with challenges which are complex, which nobody had thought would emerge so suddenly. So what do we do? Maybe in Afghanistan we say we will wait, watch, and take a decision later. But in how many places can we say this? In Africa also we'll wait, watch, and see how events are developing. Somewhere we'll have to make a conscious decision of shift our priorities, decide which country is important for us, and then make an investment there and try to influence developments there. That is all we have for you this week. And we are afraid that we have not been very reassuring, we have not been very starry-eyed and optimistic, but that is the way international relations are. Events take place swiftly, milieu changes dramatically, and you have to be on your feet, your reflexes have to be fast, you cannot afford to have knee-jerk reactions, but you must make a stock taking of who are your long-term friends and who are your time-tested friends. Now in both cases of Afghanistan and in Africa, I think some similarities are there. We, over the past 2 decades almost, have fallen prey to this mirage that American interest and our interests coincide. We forget that America is a rich country and America as a superpower at the moment is in decline. China, our adversary, is on the ascendant, is a much more ruthless adversary to have, and once Americans decide to cut their losses and withdraw from various theaters, whether it is Middle East, whether it is Syria, Iraq, whether it is Afghanistan, the fact remains that the vacuum created by their withdrawal is going to be filled up not necessarily by friends of India, and because Indians put all their eggs, strategic eggs, so to speak, on American basket, we have neglected our time-tested relationship, friendship with Russia, and Russia may have itself looked the other way to Europe rather than to Asia, but we gave Russians the impression, especially Putin the impression, that they did not matter as much they had in past. So our investment in Sakhalin was almost $3 billion at one stage. There was great cooperation about the BrahMos missile, but right now when we buy the S-400 missiles from Russia, we look one way towards America for their approval. Would they let us have it or would they not let us have it? What is interesting is the Russian-Chinese coincidence of interest at the moment seems to be something which again does not have too much of a place for India, because we have a confrontation, military confrontation with China in the Galwan Valley in Ladakh, elsewhere in the eastern border. This is not going to change in a hurry. China's support of Pakistan, cultivated over 6 decades, is not going to change. And if Iran comes closer to China and Pakistan, then this whole theater becomes far more volatile that Indians had accepted. I should think that what we should conclude is that nobody in the Indian Foreign Office had thought that Americans would withdraw so dramatically and vacate the space for others so soon. The same thing applies to the African continent. Are we in a position to influence developments there? Probably the situation is a little better than Afghanistan and South Asia and Central Asia, but there again the distance is there, and the common factor there is again the Islamic, call them bandits, call them outlaws, but people like Boko Haram, people like ISIL, people like the Islamic Caliphate of West Africa are going to be difficult to cope with, because neither do the governments there have the will, like the government in Kabul, to exercise their sovereign power. Corruption is there, and India is much too distant a neighbor. Keep thinking about these things till we meet again next week. Thank you and goodbye.